Ty Beal, welcome back to the show. How you doing?
Good to see you.
One of my favorite people in nutrition, and so grateful to have gotten to know you over the past couple months. And I was on your podcast recently, which I highly recommend people check out. The Ty Beal Show.
Yeah, that's it.
Love it. But a legitimate, bona fide nutrition researcher in-house. I'm super excited to pick your brains on all things nutrition, micronutrients, nutrient density. But let's start with this super exciting new study that you just published, looking at ranking the nutrient density of common foods, which is super important. So in your estimation, based on this new research that you've just published, what are the top foods to eat for slowing aging, extending lifespan, and fighting disease?
That's a great question. I think the top three foods would be fatty fish and shellfish, dark green leafy vegetables like kale, spinach, etc., and organ meats like liver, heart, kidney.
Now, these are not, at the outset I said that they were common foods. A lot of the foods on the list are common, but those three foods, like not many people are eating organ meats and not many people are eating shellfish with any regularity.
That's right. I mean,
Is there
shellfish,
a consequence to that?
well, nutrient deficiencies, suboptimal health. So shellfish are not, I mean, most people think of shrimp, right? Or maybe lobster, but I'm talking about bivalves, which is a weird name, but it's like mussels, clams, oysters. Super nutrient dense. People don't consume them very often in the U.S., but they're also kind of expensive in the U.S., or you have to cook them in a certain way. Most people aren't very familiar with them, right? And then organ meats, they're pretty off-putting in terms of flavor to a lot of people. If you didn't grow up with liver and onions or something, you're not just going to say, let me pop some chicken livers, right?
Exactly. So, but you think that these foods are worth eating? What about them puts them at the top of your list?
Yeah, well, we ranked foods according to a bunch of different metrics on nutrient density and other aspects that really relate to health. So we looked at the vitamins, the minerals that are common public health issues. We looked at the protein and the protein quality, bioavailability considered. We looked at omega-3 fatty acids, including the kind of DHA and EPA, which are the longer chain omega-3s, which are really bioavailable and associated with brain health and different beneficial aspects of protecting, against chronic disease. We looked at fiber. We looked at the ratios of certain nutrients. So this kind of tells you the quality of the food. When you look at the carbohydrate to fiber ratio, it's showing you how much fiber is in there compared to the carbs. So you're not getting a bunch of those refined carbs. You're getting more of the fiber-rich ones. We looked at things like the sodium to potassium ratio, so you can kind of see how processed the food is. If there's a lot of the intrinsic nutritional value of the food, it's going to be high in potassium, lower in sodium, right? So we look at all these different factors, including the energy density, the amount of calories in the food, and it kind of tells us where do these foods fall. And you can look across food groups, you can look within food groups, and that kind of tells you where they sit.
I mean, very practical. Now, I think what's so cool about your work is that you first popped onto everybody's radar, whether they realize it or not, when you published a reaction to the food compass, food scoring system, nutrient scoring system, whatever you want to call it, that was published by Tufts University researchers a couple of years ago now at this point, like 2 years ago.
Yeah.
You were like looking at this research as a nutrition scientist, and you were like, wait a minute, based on this scoring system, it seems to be that, like, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to be the case that it's scoring Fruit Loops and Lucky Charms above foods like ground beef and eggs and other foods that like even a 7-year-old would look at and be like, that's a pretty healthy food. Are you seriously telling me that Lucky Charms are healthier than those?
Yeah.
And so yeah, maybe tell us about that and then your sort of journey to publishing your new sort of imagining of what a more appropriate food scoring system might look like.
Yeah, well, I looked at this study that came out and I was excited about it because I was like, this is awesome. There's a really rigorous scientific group, and they went through and they did sophisticated things looking at all sorts of compounds in the foods. But when I started to look at the findings, it didn't really make sense, even just from a common sense perspective. Like you said, my 7-year-old would have been able to tell you eggs are healthy, right? They're not below like Lucky Charms. But in fact, the rating system kind of had some weird anomalies that didn't quite make sense to me. So I looked into it a little more and I thought, you know what? There's decisions at each step in this process that led these foods to rank this way. I thought, I think I can do something that's a bit better and a bit more, the same type of rigor, but it comes out with results that most people can agree with, right? And that's what I set out to do with this study. So we went through and we analyzed all the different foods. So we looked at 5 minerals. So we looked at iron, zinc, calcium, magnesium, potassium, minerals that were often lacking in the diet, right? They're public health concern. We want to get more of them generally, right? Vitamins, we did the same thing with 11 vitamins. Again, I broke down all the other aspects we looked at, and we kind of looked at how do these, essential nutrients fit in terms of the number of, nutrients per calorie. We looked at nutrients per gram. So you kind of, if you look at just one or the other, you get weird biases, right? Let's say you're looking at nutrient per calorie. Nuts and seeds don't perform very well because they're really high in calories, right? Avocados, they don't necessarily perform very well because they're high in calories. Now, if you look at nutrients per gram, that's going to show that those foods actually perform better. Now, if you look at nutrients per calorie, dark leafy greens have almost no calories, right? So they're going to score off the charts, but we know you can't just eat all your calories there with the dark leafy greens. You'd be sick, right? You wouldn't be okay. So we kind of combine both of those approaches. Nutrient density in terms of calories, nutrient density in terms of mass. We looked at things holistically and tried to come up with a sensible system that produces foods that are, not just nutrient dense, but also protective against these chronic diseases that we're suffering from today.
Yeah, it's so awesome. I mean, I'm looking at the paradigm, I guess, that you use, like the algorithm that you've devised, your nutrient ratios, saturated to unsaturated fatty acids, sodium to potassium, carbs to fiber, which I think is brilliant, actually. And then you've got your vitamins, your minerals, your protein, omega-3s, and then fiber and calories. I think it's so great because, I think everybody feels a sense of having been had by, the nutrition information that we've been, spoon-fed, for lack of a better term, over decades past that would hyperfixate and get hung up on individual nutrients, like cholesterol is, I think, the perfect example of that, which is what led to eggs being deemed unhealthy for decades.
Right.
Like eggs were considered unhealthy for decades because their yolks contained cholesterol, like this one nutrient that our previous scoring system or whatever you want to call it just like seemed to obsess over, right? And we now know that dietary cholesterol for most people doesn't really have that meaningful of an impact on blood lipids. But like that's decades lost of like people that could have been eating eggs and instead they were eating Frosted Flakes instead.
Yeah, eggs were vilified, right? Enemy number one.
Enemy number one. So what is it going to take then for your scoring system to be like, what's the goal then to like have it be adopted and make its way into like front of label packaging?
I think there's a lot of purposes. Okay, so in the global kind of context that I work often, we look for foods to prioritize. And speaking of eggs, one of the foods we often promote is eggs because there's very poor, nutrient poor diets. There's a lot of stunting, there's anemia, and poor child development outcomes, child growth. And when you add eggs to a diet that's highly based on just starches, like, whether it's maize, which is corn, or wheat, or rice, or plantains, the diet in poor context is usually missing a lot of nutrients. So you introduce eggs. Now, what we wanted to do is understand, okay, what are the most nutritious sources to prioritize? Because oftentimes when you're doing a program or you're doing a policy in a country, in a context, you want to be able to prioritize specific ones, right? And that gives you the best impact you can have if you're going to focus on, for example, organ meats or dark leafy greens or eggs, right? It's going to give you a lot of impact, as you can see. So we wanted to kind of have a system that went through all the different foods available in a context and rated those foods and ranked them in a hierarchy of, these are really, really the top performers, right? And these ones, they're okay, but not going to give you the same boost, and then ones that you really want to avoid. But we thought about this like more holistically, thinking about ultra-processed foods and all these kind of refined ingredients as well. And so we added a component also about ultra-processing, and then you can trick the system. Now, here's why a lot of foods on typical, what are called nutrient profiling systems, which Food Compass was one of these, and so is my system, which is the nutritional value score. If you add nutrients to a food, you can make it look really good, right? Think about breakfast cereals. Do you look at the box and it looks like a multivitamin? It's just got like dozens of these nutrients added to it, right? But we know that the foods themselves do not contain the same food matrix, all the compounds that work synergistically. They don't have the same benefits. So we wanted to find out, okay, how do we stop the industry from gaming the system? And we created sort of penalties. So you get some benefit from added nutrients, but they're not the same as the nutrients found in whole foods, right? And ultra processing doesn't immediately mean that food's unhealthy, but it kind of it docks something on it, right? And so we created a sensible approach. And I think the use can be very widespread depending on how you implement this. And there's always, you can make adjustments depending on the purpose. So you mentioned front of package labeling. So front of package labeling, for those who don't know, is like, do you have some sort of health claim on there? Do you say, this food is low in sodium, right? Or this is low in saturated fat. So you can make health claims based on the score of a food, on the rating of a food, based on a comprehensive set of scores. So you can have things that they have some sort of marking. Let's say it's a green, yellow, and a red, like a stop sign sort of warning, where okay, the green foods we want to consume more of, right? The red foods we want to limit. Yellow foods have in moderation, something like that. So that can happen, but then you also want to understand, in terms of where these foods placed. Now, if you go into a grocery store, they're designed to sell and keep you in the store longer, as long as they can, right? Even the height at where things are placed are meant to try to attract you. And children's cereals placed where they can see it and they can see the cartoon characters and everything. So what you can do is you can actually use something like our food rating system to prioritize which foods are going to be emphasized in this design of the grocery store, so that people are actually going to be exposed to the healthier options more. Instead of the checkout aisle, you have all these impulse buys. Maybe there's some healthier options that can meet your needs. You can do this in online stores. So you can use the food rating to say, when people search for a certain type of food, or when they're just going to the homepage, which foods are going to show up. Now, it's not random right now. Companies pay for their foods, just like they pay for placement in stores, they pay for placement online. So when you're doing shopping online, if you actually have this implemented at the government level, you can create systems where now you're prioritizing and emphasizing the most nutritious, nutrient-dense foods, right? We have this real food message. Well, how do you get people to do that, right? One of the ways is to be able to distinguish between the more nutrient-dense foods and the less nutrient-dense foods when you look at all the foods in the U.S. food supply. And so it gives you a chance to be able to prioritize to consumers. There's a lot of stuff on the back end you can do in terms of policies, like you can do subsidies or taxes, right? You can tax something that scores poorly, like sugar-sweetened beverages. You can invest into the foods like dark leafy greens or fresh produce that's more nutritious. And what we find, surprisingly, is that it's not just like this message of just eat a variety of fresh foods is healthy. That is true to some extent, but there's a huge difference, right? A watermelon doesn't contain the same nutrient density as a guava. A dark leafy green doesn't contain the same nutrient density as a cucumber, right? And so that system lets you distinguish, okay, there's actually like vegetables are good for you, but here's the ones that are really good for you, right?
So interesting. Yeah. I mean, are there any ultra processed foods that you would consider deserving of like the healthy designation?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of exceptions with ultra processed foods. They're not necessarily going to score the top marks, but I think you could see, for example, an unsweetened soy milk in terms of the milk. So that actually scores pretty similarly to cow's milk because the nutrient density's there, the protein's there. You don't have the added sugar, right? So the carb to fiber ratio is not a problem, and you don't have a lot of sodium. So there are foods like soy milk, tofu. If you're looking at breakfast cereals, here's one that's kind of controversial. You think of Cheerios, right? Well, when most people think of Cheerios, they also think of the more commonly like Honey Nut Cheerios, right? There's a big difference. If you look at Honey Nut Cheerios per serving, 12 grams of sugar. That's the same as Lucky Charms. So that's pretty much just like, I would consider that like a dessert or a type of junk food, right? Cheerios, plain Cheerios, actually don't have much added sugar. It's like 2 grams of added sugar. Now, they do have reconstituted whole grains, and they have some starch added to it, filler. So it's not like the same thing as eating oatmeal. But if you're going to choose a breakfast cereal, for example, right, it's not too bad in terms of other options available. And so our system shows that. It gets decent marks. It's okay. It's like sort of moderate marks. And you have added nutrients, which when you're nutrient deficient, that can help. So I think like the nuance around the ultra processed foods, this helps distinguish between the more nutritious ultra processed foods and the less nutritious ultra processed foods. One of the key metrics, believe it or not, to distinguish that is the ratio of sodium to potassium.
Interesting. Wait, say that again?
Ratio of sodium to potassium. Now go into the supermarket, try this out. Look at all the packaged products. Think of a breakfast cereal, think of a protein bar, granola bar or something. Look at how much sodium is in there and how much potassium is in there. Now, the higher the sodium and the lower the potassium, the more processed and highly refined it is, less health benefits it has. Now, plants have tons of potassium in them naturally. So if you're having a processed food packaged food that's mostly plant-based, and it's really low in potassium, you know there's very little of the whole food in there. They've refined it to a severe degree so that you don't have a lot of that. And you'll see there's added sodium, so then you have really high sodium. So if you look at a whole food, you're going to find ratios of like 2, 3, 4, 5 in terms of more potassium times than sodium, right? And if you look at a refined packaged product, you're gonna have very little potassium and really high in sodium. So it's a kind of a little trick if you want to look at the package, just that metric, which is included in our score, but it's kind of a way if you're just looking at packaged foods, which ones contain more of the whole food, right? Because it's hard to tell sometimes.
Wow. So you're saying that the sodium to potassium or potassium to sodium ratio is in a way like a proxy, like you can use that to determine the degree of processing of the food that you're looking at.
Totally. Yeah. Look at any sort of protein bar, breakfast cereal. I mean, any packaged food, you'll see the ones that are more minimally processed will have more potassium and less sodium.
Wow. And ideally, you want it to be like above 1 in favor of potassium. You want there to be more potassium than sodium.
Yeah. And the higher, the better. So if you're looking at the sodium to potassium ratio, you want that to be really as low as it can be, right? Because 1-to-1, at least okay, there's a fair amount of potassium here, not too much sodium.
That's so interesting.
You should look for orders of magnitude of 2, 3, 4.
Wow.
And above.
Potassium is like really hard to come by these days. Like I remember reading, like this was years ago, but that there was a paper speculating that our hunter-gatherer ancestors consumed something like
10 grams or something.
Something like that. Yeah, crazy, like a crazy high level of potassium relative to today.
Yeah, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Part of it is because the wild foods that our ancestors ate were just higher in nutrients in general. We hadn't bred them yet to be like sweeter and grow faster and larger and whatever. So that's part of it. But the other part of it is the processing. So that is one way that you really lose a lot of these ingredients. Now, if you notice, even with this protein craze, which I like protein, but I think it's misguided in a lot of ways, right? You see the breakfast cereal, it's high protein. Now, if you just use extracts, so you're extracting the protein out of pea protein, let's say, or whey protein, whatever, you'll see it in the sodium to potassium ratio. You can't trick that system very easily unless you add potassium. And no food industry group is adding potassium to the foods, right? So you're going to see that clearly. It's just a way to identify really how refined is this food that I'm purchasing here.
That's so interesting. Can you speak to any of the benefits of eating more potassium, like the health benefits of eating more potassium?
So most of us get far too little potassium. And potassium is, for looking in the context of sodium and cardiovascular health, sodium is not necessarily a problem unless you have much higher sodium than potassium. So it's really protective of being able to have more sodium and not have any risk to blood pressure, for example, which is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. So there's cardiovascular benefits. There's a lot of different benefits in terms of if you don't have your essential nutrient needs, all of these essential nutrients have a role in, ATP production, energy production, mitochondria, all of that. So there's other factors that potassium plays a role, but in general, it's the cardiovascular health that we want. And then also it's sort of associated with these foods that are high in potassium, which you look at like the benefits of fruits and vegetable consumption, right? And you look at like nuts and seeds, you have really a lot of benefits from those foods. So it's partly the potassium, but also partially the whole food source of that potassium that contains all the other compounds in a food matrix that's beneficial.
Wow. So it's kind of like, potassium is kind of like a perfect surrogate for just like eating whole foods, like whole food consumption.
Yeah, as long as it's there and it's not added, which to this point, maybe after this launches, people will start adding potassium to their foods. But yeah,
my dad. I wonder if you could speak to why this might have happened. My dad started supplementing with potassium because he was having like crazy leg cramps at night. Like he could like barely stand for extended periods because he was having like these cramps in his legs, and a doctor recommended that he start taking more like these potassium. I'm not right. People shouldn't probably supplement with potassium because it's like probably pretty easy to overdo. It's like one of these minerals that like you ideally want within the whole food matrix. But he started supplementing with it, and like he said that he had like this like marked improvement in leg cramps.
I've heard that too, and also with magnesium. So I think that there is a role for supplementation. Now, I will admit, I have a lot of potassium from natural whole foods, but I do a little bit of supplementing. So in the morning, I'll take a psyllium husk powder, a little bit of psyllium husk powder with potassium chloride, which is also called New Salt. That's kind of the brand, right? And there's salt substitutes, replacements. Personally, I think they taste terrible. I tried it on some steak once, and I was like, I can't do it. I'm not going to do it. So, but I do have a little bit. So I think you're right about you don't want to overdo it, right? And part of the benefit of potassium probably in studies is when it's sort of a whole food source of it. But I do think that when you have this imbalance in the ratio, adding a little bit is probably just going to be a benefit. So I sprinkle a little bit of that potassium chloride with the psyllium husk powder in the morning, every morning. So just make sure I get a little bit more.
Wow. So new salt is that that tastes bad? It doesn't taste like salt. It tastes like something.
Okay. My brother thinks that it tastes okay. You can get used to it. I think it tastes terrible.
Okay. Good to know. I'm interested in trying it. Like maybe I could like put like a pinch.
You can cut it with regular salt, and there's some salt brands that will give you a blend where you mix it, right?
Interesting. So like if there's something that you regularly use table salt for, and you just want to cut it, that's probably better than nothing.
Right.
Very interesting. Woody, I know we talked a little bit about this on your last appearance of the show, but I am a sucker for what I guess many people are now referring to as like the deluge of protein slop on the market, like protein enriched ultra processed foods. Like I will admit, I am a sucker for protein enriched tortilla chips and protein enriched. I don't know. There's a company. Zero affiliation, but they sent me like these like high protein donuts that I think are tasty as hell. And they're the macros are good, like 20 grams of protein for 160 calories. Like the macros are great, but I'm not kidding myself. I know that they're highly processed foods, but they're like processed foods with like a little bit of a protein halo on them because they help you conveniently hit your protein target. And it's more exciting sometimes than just eating more cottage cheese or another boiled egg or more fat-free Greek yogurt or a protein shake. So curious your take on the increasing prominence of these protein-enriched ultra-processed foods.
Well, if you look at the new dietary guidelines for Americans, you'll actually see it says focus on food sources of protein from plant and animal sources. So there's a reason for that. I don't think there's a lot of evidence that lots of protein in highly processed foods is going to be beneficial. I think that we talked about this before. It's probably better to have a food that's higher in protein that's ultra processed. There's probably some satiety benefits of that. But I mean, I could overeat a plate of high protein cookies. Like just because it has protein in that refined, extracted ingredient doesn't mean I'm going to be satiated from those foods. So I think it's the whole food sources of protein are still better. But yeah, if you're gonna work out and you're on the go and afterwards, I don't think it's a problem like having the highly processed, especially if you're gonna have those foods. It's like when you're working out and you're doing a lot of resistance training, it's a good way to mix it up because it can get boring or a bit unappealing to be having the same protein stuff that you're just kind of having day in and day out.
Yeah, like, wait, let me just put a chicken breast in my pocket. No, sometimes it's like, and actually the macros on some of them are better than most protein bars. Like the form factor, they're not protein bars, but the macros are better than protein bars. Mm-hmm. Like I have these protein chips, like these protein tortilla chips in my pantry, and it's like 150 calories, 20 grams of protein. That's better than most protein bars. And the protein is like really high quality. Mm-hmm. It's like dairy protein or something. So
I would think of those as sort of like supplements almost. Like you're going to get the protein, but you're not getting a lot. Even if you have the added fiber, again, it's refined and extracted and combined together. You're losing a lot of the benefits of whole foods. So I wouldn't like kid yourself, or we shouldn't kid ourselves into like, I can just have protein chips and salsa for everything, and I can have protein enriched donuts and I'll be fine. Like, right? Like, I don't think that's the case, but for post workout, right? And you want to get some protein, I don't think there's a problem with that.
Thank you for that. Because I'm trying to hit my, I'm trying for like a gram of protein per my pound, my poundage in body weight. And so it makes it somewhat more convenient, but I do give myself like a limit, like one a day, most adults today, the majority of their diet is ultra processed, right? Like 60% of their calories. So I figure if I'm having like one ultra processed food or one or two, like.
And those particular types, they're not going to be the same as having, normal ultra processed foods like a cake or cookies that just have only refined flour and oil and sugar. Like that's not, it's not going to be as problematic when you're higher in fiber and protein,
Amen. Love it. As you were doing this research for your new paper, I mean, did any foods make it high on the list or conversely low on the list that surprised you?
Yeah, I think this is tricky. With any system, you're never going to be fully satisfied. So I have some, and people have pointed this out on the post that I made on socials, that cheese, whole fat cheese scores relatively low. It's kind of moderate, right? And I would have liked to see that score higher, because when you look at the studies linking cheese to health outcomes, it's generally a positive impact, right? But in nutrient profiling, there's a lot of sodium in cheese and there's a lot of energy density. And so it can be hard to show the benefits. I think if we had more data, if we looked at things like, vitamin K2, if we looked at the overall, the quality of the food in a way that we can't, like the fermented benefits of fermented foods, we didn't really have the data to do that. So I think cheese is one that I would have liked to see score higher. In terms of foods that score high, some of the breakfast cereals score, I think, a little bit higher than I would like, just from a conceptual standpoint that these are highly processed foods. So I think the added nutrients is beneficial, but it's not necessarily going to have the same benefit as if you get those from a whole food. So I think if you look at the rating of oatmeal and Cheerios, they're pretty similar. And I think there's an argument that oatmeal would be healthier because it's a more wholesome, minimally processed food. But I think when you think about the context of people not having enough nutrients, even fortified, those nutrients do contribute to nutrient adequacy. So there's sort of a trade-off there. We tried to do it in a balanced way, but I think some of those foods snuck up maybe higher than other foods.
Interesting. Yeah, the cheese thing is perplexing. I think dairy is like a food. It's such a fascinating food category. I mean, it has, as a percentage of calories, I believe more saturated fat than any food, but yet the data on it links it to neutral, if not beneficial, cardiovascular outcomes.
Yeah, it's super impressive. I mean, people would be glad to hear that.
Yeah.
Cheese is, who doesn't like cheese, right?
Well, it is super nutrient dense, right? I mean, it's like
Yeah.
a good source of protein, calcium, magnesium.
I think just dairy in general is this amazing food, like the matrix, and I think we talked about this on my show, but like the milk fat globule membrane and the way that the probiotics and the beneficial bacteria, like there is just something very wholesome. And I think it's even surprising to see that the full fat dairy versus the non-fat dairy, it does just as well. Like there's no real increased weight gain from full fat dairy, whole dairy sources, which is kind of counterintuitive, but there's something going on there with the food matrix, probably satiety, nutrient interactions that maybe is not always able to be quantified in a nutrient, even a dietary attribute approach.
I wonder if it's just that people who are buying more full-fat dairy are just more prone to eating more whole foods in general, as opposed to low and fat-free, which are processed. And so, maybe the consumers who are more regularly buying reduced fat and fat-free dairy, like if you look at their shopping carts, maybe they're buying that alongside lots of other highly processed foods.
I mean, it could be, but most of the studies try to adjust for that type of thing, and cheese still comes out performing better, right, than even whole milk. So who knows?
Did you get granular and look at like specific types of cheese?
Yes, we did. So there's a graphic that kind of scores the food group, right? So you have like dark leafy greens, and organ meats, for example. But when you look within those, we have the data on over 1,000 foods now. We've been building this for a while now. And you can see the ratings of this within that food group can vary quite a bit. So for example, organ meats, you have liver, you have kidney, you have spleen, you have heart, and you have it from all the different animals. And we can actually see the scores. Now, we grouped them by food groups that generally have relatively consistent nutrient profiles. So they're going to score relatively similar, but there is some variation. So cheese, for example, I think we had a paneer cheese, which scored higher in general. And I think that probably has to do with how much sodium was in there, whatever factors kind of contribute to that. But definitely there's variation within food groups. And I think that can also be informative to tell you, sure, you can in general consume this food group, but if you want the highly nutritious foods, it's not like there's necessarily superfoods that are just, only food you need and it's going to save your life, but there are differences, right? And so even within dark leafy greens, there's differences in the foods that are higher in minerals and that are higher in fiber, and that the system lets you actually disentangle those differences.
Which dark leafy green came out on top? Do you remember?
Well, it depends. So again, this is a global study. So we had data from all sorts of countries, right? And so I think when you look at it in that context, moringa, collard greens, chard, kale, spinach, they all score pretty high. But some of the greens, it's in general, it's basically a mathematical equation that's calculating this. So the greens that have lower nutrient content, lower fiber content, right, lower potassium, they're just not going to score as well. I can't remember the lowest scoring green off the top of my head.
Iceberg lettuce?
Well, iceberg lettuce is not a dark leafy green, but it definitely would score lower. And this is the thing. When you're making, nutrition recommendations or guidelines, you say consume lettuce, right? Well, there's a huge difference between consuming iceberg lettuce versus romaine lettuce or kale or chard or whatever. And so I think that's important. There's a big difference in those foods.
Very interesting. Okay, so from a cheese standpoint, paneer, which is like an Indian cheese, is it not?
Yeah, and again, we looked at countries in South Asia, we looked in Africa, and we even had some countries, I think, in Latin America as well.
What about processed meats? Processed meats are always a contentious topic, especially on social media. People are like, they're the worst thing. You should avoid them at all costs. But I mean, certainly ground beef is a form of processed meat. Sliced deli turkey, right? That hasn't been reconstituted, but it's just a turkey breast that you're getting sliced. Maybe it's been smoked or some, honey flavoring added to it. Like, would you say processed meat is a continuum, or you're generally better off avoiding all of it? Even though it's such a huge category, I don't know how you possibly would.
That is one of the advances of this study too, because most guidelines will just recommend reduced consumption of processed meat, full stop. No difference between a chicken nugget, bologna versus like a cured ham with just salt in there. So actually processed meat, ground beef does not fit into that category. It's a minimally processed. So if you're looking at the NOVA system for ultra processing, it's not even processed. It's actually considered typically a minimally processed food because it's just the meat and it's just ground. But you have all these different levels now of processing. And what we did is we separated we did this for individual foods as well, but we had groups for moderately processed meat. So let me just say, okay, so we had the minimally processed meat. That's like a ground beef. Then we had the moderately processed meat, right, which is like a ham or something, right? And then you have the ultra processed meat, which is like a chicken nugget or something. And if you look at a chicken nugget, if you look at the nutrient content, I mean, there's almost no iron in there. Like it's so refined that you do lose a lot of the nutritional value. And so when you look at those, I mean, it's exactly what you would expect from our scoring and from the nutritional profiles. But the minimally processed meat is going to score higher. It actually scores pretty high. Meat is a pretty nutrient dense, nutritious food. Then you have the moderately processed meat. That's pretty low. It scores. I'm trying to think of the exact score. It's probably, this scale goes from 1 to 100, right? 100 is the best, 1 is the lowest. It's probably in the around 40 to 50, which is pretty decent scoring. So if you're going to look at a minimally processed meat or a processed meat like ham that would typically fall under a processed meat category and be discouraged from consumption, this system shows it's actually pretty nutritious. But the highly processed, ultra processed meats perform much worse.
And as an example of ultra processed meat, what would that look like? Like chicken nuggets, like just breaded, reconstituted chicken and oil?
Yeah, chicken nuggets is a classic example. I think in terms of lunch meat, probably bologna would be considered that, right? So it's less of the actual meat, more and more additives. So some of the additives that, nitrates, nitrites, things that have been linked to certain chronic disease risks.
What food scored the worst on your nutrient profiling system?
So in general, in terms of food groups, it's sugar sweetened beverages, which should not be surprising, right? There's no nutritional value and just nutritional risk. There's just sugar, right? Now, if we looked at the individual food, Gatorade. Now, this is a bit, there's a context for Gatorade. If you're working out, you're running a marathon, like this is not to say don't consume Gatorade or something. You need electrolytes. But in general, when you have, people actually drink a lot of these. These are fountain drinks, right? And so if you're an adolescent on lunch break and you're having a bunch of Gatorade, it's not only high in sugar, but it's also high in a bunch of added sodium as well. So that one actually scored the worst just in terms of when you look at the nutrient profile, the sugar, the added sodium. But sugar sweetened beverages, we had other foods that are really low on there, like instant noodles. That's one. Think of like ramen. There's just sodium and refined flour. That's like basically what's in there, right? So there's almost no nutritional value. very high glycemic index, very high in sodium, not a lot of potassium, no whole foods left in there, right? And then you have a lot of other junk foods. We had things like cookies. I think we had cake, even chips. They score pretty low. So those are, I think, the lowest scoring foods.
Yeah, if I'm just reading from the graph, but it's soft drinks, baked grain-based sweets, instant noodles, packaged ultra-processed salty snacks. What would those be considered?
Those are like chips, veggie straws, right? I mean, anything that's it dissolves in your mouth. It's crispy and dissolves in your mouth. So that packaged salty snack food.
Egg substitute. That's like fairly surprising to see so low, because I would never buy egg substitute. I eat eggs, but like you would think that manufacturers would be like jacking it at least with like some nutrient value if they're trying to like replace eggs for people.
Yeah, I mean, this is interesting. So the reason I put that there is because I think Food Compass had egg substitute and it was higher than eggs. It's like, wait, why is the egg substitute higher than eggs? I think it was like twice as high or something, like 60 compared to 30. And so, I mean, the system treats all foods the same, right? It's basically a mathematical algorithm. And when you look at what's actually in that, it's a lot of refined ingredients that don't have a lot of nutritional value, right? So you're not getting a lot of micronutrients in there. And that may be hidden on a package. Like you can get a package that says low in fat and cholesterol and people can think, okay, it's healthy, it's egg substitute, right? But it's not actually better when you look at it, I think, objectively from a system that makes sense.
People have just like for so long been so misled. It's so frustrating, but I'm so grateful that we live in a time now where this information can actually get out there, whether it's on X or Instagram or now with the publication of the new dietary guidelines, which you played a role in helping to craft. So thank you for doing that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's super exciting stuff. I feel like we're in a new era where transparency is, I mean, it's not we don't have like full transparency yet, but I mean, we're trending at least in that direction.
Yeah, I agree. I think I'm really pleased to see where we're headed. You know, the guidelines calling out ultra-processed foods, refined flours, added sugars, emphasizing whole foods, nutrient-dense foods. And I think this system hopefully will be used to help get healthier, nutritious, real foods into people's, into their grocery carts and ultimately into their diets. So that's the goal.
Well, you helped architect the latest dietary guidelines. I mean, what would be the roadblocks in terms of getting this to see greater adoption?
Well, I'm supposed to have a meeting with somebody at the FDA who kind of has seen the system, thinks it's a good idea. We can kind of talk through what it could look like. So I think there are options at the policy level, and there's different ways that this can happen. But if you're looking for a system to incentivize either which foods do we invest in more? Like when you think of subsidies, we have all sorts of subsidies we put in foods, and sometimes it's not really evidence-based. It's just the subsidies there. Sometimes it's influenced by industry. So if you think about like sort of the corn, soy, wheat industry, thinking of trying, how do we get, we need to get these into more and more products, right? And so sometimes those crops can be subsidized when you want to be subsidizing sort of the real foods, the fresh produce and such. So there's a lot of nuance though in terms of, well, if you're going to be subsidizing foods, which ones would have the best impact on nutritional value, right? And so that helps you do that. And also at the same time, it helps you think about when you're restricting or limiting, let's say it's for SNAP, let's say it's for school meals, you can use this system to help kind of categorize foods that are the most problematic, because right now there's not a clear way to do that. I think there's some sort of common sense. We say, oh, well, candy is bad for you. But actually, when you come down to the policy, it's like, how do you define candy? What ingredients do you need, right? It can be tricky. It's a lot harder than you would think. You don't just have a simple way to restrict it in policies. So this could be actually used to where we say, we're going to rate these foods or these food groups. And if you're going to score in the bottom third or something, right, you're not going to be able to qualify for funding subsidies or something, right? And maybe some of the lowest scoring foods can be, you could have a warning sign or something, right? There's actually ways to do that. You can put a warning sign on sugar sweetened beverages. You can remove the marketing of foods that are not particularly healthy, right? You can use a requirement to say you have a health claim if it meets certain guidelines on this thing in terms of nutritional value. So I think there's a lot of ways that this can be done to influence what people eat. And then, of course, whatever type of intervention. So if you're going to try to make a difference in what people eat, not just at the policy level, but let's say you're going, you have nonprofits and they're going to invest in something that they want to promote. This gives a bit of a guidance from a program strategy of, okay, we're going to invest in the most nutritious foods, right? Because you're going to spend money to try to get people to eat more of something. You don't want to just kind of go blindly or do something inefficiently. So this is a way to optimize the nutritional value, and you can kind of choose the foods that have the most impact.
Yeah. The slippery aspect of defining foods makes a lot of sense, because like if you have candy, if you have like a chocolate candy and it's like fake chocolate, added sugar, emulsifiers, and that's all it is, then like, yeah, obviously there's like nobody's improving their health by eating that. But then like suddenly you add some peanuts to it. Peanuts are legumes. Peanuts have protein, not the best quality protein, but like
fiber,
fiber,
potassium. Yeah.
Did the when the dietary guidelines were released, there was obviously some polarity, criticism. Like, did any of that surprise you? Was it more perplexing that people didn't just wholly embrace the idea of eating real food, which to me is like the appropriate message that we needed right now, given our current health problems. But nonetheless, obviously everything today has become political. Did some of that like squawking that occurred online surprise you?
I was expecting it, so I wasn't particularly surprised. I think what I have seen to be true over and over again is that there's a lot of politics about it, and there's a lot of criticism and attacks on both sides that is not like constructive. But when you actually sit down and talk to somebody, whether that's a policymaker, a nutrition scientist who's more liberal in the academic community, or a nutrition scientist who's more conservative, you actually agree on like 90% of things, right? And so I think it's like artificially induced controversy for the sake of whatever, like whether it's outrage on social media because it drives clicks and attention, right? Or YouTube, or whether it's politics where people are saying, we want to kind of demonstrate that this is way better or something. And I think it's not doing anyone, especially the American people, a service. So I would love to see a bit more of a collaborative, constructive sort of approach. And I think the guidelines are pretty sensible, right? Like real food, most people agree with that. Limit highly processed foods. And you can debate about how much meat, how much animal plant protein do you want to have, but the basics are there, and most people agree.
Yeah, and it's completely not partisan. I mean, eat real food is not a partisan like mandate. And I, from my vantage point, a lot of the criticisms were actually quite disingenuous. Like they weren't even like real solid criticisms. Like I think most rational, reasonable people would look at the guidelines and be like, anybody following this like would get healthier. Like there's no ambiguity about it. It's like eat minimally processed foods, which I think is what we've so sorely needed, because I mean, the guidelines in the past have been so readily captured by the food industry, and so, yeah, I thought it was such a welcome message. And the criticisms were just like, well, there's red meat at the base of it. How could anybody eat significant amounts of red meat while still, meeting the 10% saturated fat guideline? Like it's so contradictory. And I'm like, and from my outside vantage point, I was like, no, it's not. It's like lean red meat exists. Like I went to ChatGPT and I was like, ChatGPT, architect me a 6-day meal plan, maximally including red meat. Not that I would eat like this, but I was just like, just to prove them the naysayers wrong, I was like, maximally including red meat that comfortably lands within the 10% saturated fat dietary guideline. Within seconds, I had a 6-day meal plan. Yeah. It was delicious. It would get anybody lean and healthy.
Yeah, and I've looked at that too. I think that's one of the criticisms. But yeah, there are lots of ways to design a diet within the 10%. And I think on the same token, though, there's also this, I think, artificial portraying of these guidelines as just so vastly different, when there are some big changes. Like the big changes are the really calling out highly processed foods and refined carbs and stronger limits on added sugars. But I think it went a bit overboard, where it's like, they're completely radical 180. And when you look at the guidelines previously, like there is a focus. You look at nutrient density, it's in there over 100 times in the previous DGAC report. You look at, they emphasize minimally processed foods. But I do think that it's a bummer that there was not a specific calling out of ultra processed foods or highly processed foods. Refined grains were not really limited as much as I think they needed to be. So I think this is like a big step forward for sure. And I think the pushback mostly comes from probably politics and artificial drama that
Artificial
doesn't
drama.
need to be there.
Antagonists on social media.
Yeah.
Yeah, like clout chasers on social media. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you clarify? There was some controversy about alcohol, and from my vantage point, it seemed like the new guidelines were more strict on alcohol, not making a specific recommendation to consume alcohol, basically stating the less you consume, the better. But it was spun in a way that made it sound like the new dietary guidelines were more lax with regards to alcohol. But that's not how it seemed to me. To me, the prior guidelines made an allowance for 1 to 2 servings a night of alcohol for men, 1 serving per night or whatever day for women. So it like defined moderation and excused daily alcohol consumption, basically. Whereas the new iteration was basically like the less you drink, the better.
Yeah. I had a similar reaction when I read it. I thought this is a bit more, and this is the kind of intent of these guidelines, to make them simple, short, common sense. So I think just general like limiting, less is better. If you do have them in moderation. I think that message is great. I actually was surprised to see people get up in arms about the alcohol thing. But their comments were sort of, but there's no specific amount, and so people won't really know, and they can just have as much as. And I don't really see it that way. I think your point about when you actually list out numbers, I think people latch on to numbers instead of thinking, oh, less is better. It's sort of, oh, okay, it's okay to have 1 or 2. So I think there is something with that. It probably depends on how you interpret it, or people are just digging to try to find things to be critical about.
That's what I think. I mean, I think it's like very disingenuous. I mean, it's very similar to me, the stance that the new guidelines have taken towards added sugar, whereas in the past, you could interpret the prior guidelines as having made an exception for up to a certain percentage of calories coming from added sugar, whereas the latest guidelines seem to state that like you're better off eating no added sugar.
Yeah.
Like limit added sugar.
Yeah. I appreciate the stronger guidelines. They say as little as possible. And they say if you're going to have it, limit to 10 grams per meal, which would equate to lower than the 10% guideline that was there before. The one criticism I have of the guideline is that for the 2 to 10-year-old age range, they said that no amount of sugar is allowed. Added sugar. And I'm just like, I have 2 children in that age range, and that's just ludicrous. Like, there's just no way. You're never going to have a birthday party. You're never going to have a treat. You're never going to have any added sugar. And I don't think the evidence suggests that a small amount of added sugar every once in a while is a huge deal. Like, the evidence is more on these sugar-sweetened beverages, right? And the fruit juices even. So I think that was a little bit strict, but I do appreciate for sure calling out added sugar, reducing it. And in 6 to 23-month-old children, it's 0, which it should be. And that's a bit feasible, right? When you have a newborn baby who's growing in that time, you really need to be careful about what you feed them. They have very high nutrient requirements, right? But yeah, I think we need to be a little bit looser with that 2 to 10-year-old age range.
Yeah. And also, I mean, it's also, I think, important to like acknowledge what the dietary guidelines are the service that they're meant to serve, which is as a template, and like everybody's going to be different, and athletes can consume added sugar and use it to support their workouts and whatever, and like it's totally fine. Mm-hmm. But if you're sitting at a desk for 9 hours a day and you're 50 pounds overweight and you've got glucose intolerance, then like maybe that message is more directed towards that person.
Yeah, absolutely.
But when you zoom out and you look at population health, I mean, that's like most people.
Yeah. I mean, we eat way more than 10% of added sugar and calories. And if you look at school meals, they're way above 10%, even though even the previous guidelines said to keep it below 10%, right? So there's definitely a lot of work to be done to curb our sugar. And one of the things that's interesting about this, Michael Goron, who led the section on highly processed foods, added sugars, sugar-sweetened beverages, refined carbs, he really showed that these foods, your palate starts craving, right? You get used to the sweetness. But if you start cutting down on the sugar, you start reducing sugar content, it takes just a few days for your palate to kind of readjust, and you can appreciate less sweet foods again. And I think of this as me, like I don't have added sugar very often. For some reason, I tried a beverage. I think it was, at a family member's house, and there was some sort of like sweetened drink that I was just took a sip of. I remember going like this, and I was like, whoo! And I just it felt like I was being like poisoned or something. Like my palate was not used to that level of sweet. Whereas I think for most people, if you're having all that sweetness, it just seems normal. But we get desensitized. So I think the hopeful message is that you're not stuck being like so desensitized to sugar. If you reduce, even for kids, like if you're having fruit juice and you can't go completely cold turkey, like cut it with water, half water, right? That will go a long way. And then you can kind of taper it off more and more. And then you adjust. Now, the big challenge here is that our whole food environment is basically flooding us with sugary foods and beverages. And so you can do that at home. But then when your kid goes to school or goes to a friend's house or a party, right, they're going to be bombarded with these juice boxes, Capri Sun and whatnot. And that's very hard to counter. So I think there needs to be a lot of work that really gets the whole system to be aligned, that we need to reduce these sugars.
As a food scientist, like, how do you handle that with young kids?
Oh, it's not easy. Okay. So I have to say, for the first 6 to 23 months, so first 2 years of my daughter's lives, they ate incredible. Like if you were looking at the nutritional value score, they were having organ meats, they were having plain whole yogurt, eggs, just like poached eggs, hard-boiled eggs, right? They're having like meat. And they didn't know any better. They didn't know any difference, right? They were very happy eating all those foods. And I remember when my daughter first started going into sort of the daycare system, she got a taste of something. And I remember it was actually a Halloween when my daughter was 2. And she was like, "Oh, I like Snickers. These are great." And I was like, "How do you know about Snickers bars?" And I was like, "Oh, so you've been exposed to this in the classroom, right?" And I went into a daycare. I won't say which one. One of them that my daughter was at. And their whole wall, the whole door was plastered with Lucky Charms for like it was like a special holiday for like something. But like it's everywhere. It's from the minute kids are in daycare. The snacks are terrible. It's just animal crackers, right? Pretzels, just refined flour. It's really terrible. So I've had a bit of a struggle because, my kids go into these environments and they're getting exposed to these foods. And I can't just say, "Oh, well, tough luck. You can never have anything that tastes good." Like their palate does affect them. But what I try to do is just try to be sort of balanced and reasonable and give them lots of options of healthy things. And no kid, unless they have a really rare condition, is going to starve themselves. So as long as you give decent options and a variety of things, they can kind of feed themselves. So what I do is I put out, and my wife, Allie, she's a child development specialist, so she helped me with this. But like, you prepare lots of different options and you have the illusion that there's so many different things to choose from. And you'll be surprised. It's like whatever's on the table you can eat. And they'll end up eating usually just a variety of things. They'll eat till they're full. And then if they're ever watching TV, I just put a bowl of carrots, peppers, cucumbers. They just eat it mindlessly.
Wow.
But not all kids are like that. So you got to start young. I'll tell this story. So my brother was in town, and his daughter is 8 months younger than my youngest, okay? And she was, I think, 4 at the time. And I had this experience with my daughters who love cucumber and carrots. It's just sort of, we're in the car and I'll just hand them in. They'll eat it, right? And so I was like, I bet I could get your daughter to eat a vegetable while she's watching this movie. She's distracted. And he's like, "I will give you $100 if she takes one bite of that vegetable." So I'm like, "Okay, I'm going to get $100. And I walk over and I'm like, "Okay, Billy, here you go. Here's a cucumber." And she's like, "Ew." And she wouldn't even touch it. So I think it depends on what you're exposed to. So there is something to, as much as our palates are adaptable, we do get preferences from an early age. So it's another reason that you want to introduce. So even though my daughters are exposed to these food environments that are pretty unhealthy, they still eat vegetables, right? They can eat nuts. They can eat sort of foods that a lot of kids maybe wouldn't have the palate for. And that's because they were introduced, I think, early on, and they were just a part of the diet.
So these sweet foods that they're able to access when they're outside of the home doesn't necessarily displace the palate that they've formed, over years of being fed healthy foods, whole foods. Mm-hmm. They might develop, a taste and maybe even a preference for these sweeter foods, but it doesn't mean that they're going to suddenly stop liking all the foods that you.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And the other thing is I had to loosen up. I'm a pretty intense, extreme nutrition person, right? Like with my own diet, I'm like, I want to eat perfectly, whatever. And so I think my wife was like, okay, so she's about in mental health, right? And she's like, there's a lot more to well-being than just nutrition and food, like how they feel, their self-esteem, right? The fun that they have in comparison to when they're in other contexts. And so I've sort of loosened up a bit where we'll have dessert, we'll have things, but I just try to do it in moderation and make sure I get some good nutrition into them. You know?
What was the principle that you alluded to just a few moments ago where the palate can reset in adults? Like you just like train yourself to crave sweet foods less? Is that like hedonic adaptation or some kind of like, how does that recalibration work?
Yeah, I think it's in kids and adults, and it's not, I don't know the science behind it other than the taste buds basically get desensitized to sweetness. So when you have a lot of sweetness, you expect that level of sweetness for it to have the same impact on you. And what can happen, I think it can be up to 2 weeks, but even within days, you can start to reduce the preference for that if you cut the amount of sweetness that you're exposed to. So it's kind of like with anything where we build desensitization. If you think about any type of drug that you take, a medicine or something, if you take Benadryl because you have an allergic reaction, it makes you really drowsy at first. After a few days, you build a tolerance to that and you're not as drowsy. But if you stop taking it for a few weeks, then it's going to have the effect of drowsiness again. It's the same thing with the sweet taste preference, from my understanding. And so it's really just about trying to take the overall baseline level of sugar and sweetness that you're exposed to out of the diet and reduce it further and further, and then you can start to appreciate the flavors. And what's I think surprising is that there's actually a lot of flavor in foods when you reduce the sugar that you're not really getting when you have the sugar. Like the sugar overwhelms. If you look at a regular ketchup, it's so sweet that it's actually a totally different flavor than what ketchup would be without added sugar. So you can actually develop the palate for the richness of the rich flavors that nutritionally dense foods have in them intrinsically.
Yeah, I mean, I had an experience where I bought this 0-calorie lemonade, like this bottle of like the 0-calorie lemonade. I picked it up from like Erewhon, so it's like the ingredients were all great, 0 calories. I was like, okay, cool, something different than like water. And I took a sip, and it was like so overwhelmingly sweet that I had to basically like split it into different bottles so that I would have room in the bottle to dilute it with water. And I put like, I had to add water to it to make it actually palatable for me.
Right.
Because I never drank sugar sweetened beverages. So it was just like so over the top.
That was my experience too. I had an artificially sweetened, it was like aspartame, I think. Some sort of flavor. It's like a cream soda with aspartame with like no sugar. And I was like, oh, I guess I'll just try a sip of this. Same thing. Like I could not even swallow without like cringe. My body was like, don't do it. It's not like, it didn't taste good. But plenty of people, I had a coworker years ago. I had a coworker who drank nothing but soda. Like she did not have water, not like ever in the day. Her only liquid was soda. So I mean, there's people, if you do that, your palate is going to adjust and you're going to expect that level of sweetness. So I think what's happened is that our food system has gone awry. Like we have got our foods so out of touch from what they naturally were that our palate is like expecting this insane amount of sweetness, whether it's artificial or real sugar. We expect that sweetness just to have the normal stimulation of having like a dessert. When, if you think about it, we can have a dessert. Like for me, I have dark chocolate, like 85-90% dark chocolate. It tastes good and it's enjoyable. Now, if I was only eating really sweet chocolate, milk chocolate all the time, that would taste bitter. Like most people's probably reactions in the US would be, oh, it's so bitter. Like, oh, I don't want to have anything to do with that, right?
Yeah, but the more sugar you add and the more you dilute the cacao, which is the bitter, the more palatable like you make that chocolate, the more difficult it's going to be to just eat that one or two squares.
That's right. And that's why I'm just like everybody else. When I get sweet foods and delicious tasting things, I want to eat as much as I can. So like part of the reason that I will have dark chocolate, I'd probably like, in terms of my preference, I think probably like a 70-75% would taste better if I'm being honest. But I would eat the whole bar. I would eat it instantly. 100%. And so I think I balance out like what still tastes good enough to me with my current sweet palate and is not going to be too much to where I want to eat the whole thing in one sitting.
It's such a dance, but it's like a dance that this isn't like, to somebody who's like naive to these concepts and who just is used to eating mindlessly, this might sound like kind of obsessive, but it's like it's a level of diligence that I think you have to pay this level of attention today. Otherwise, it's just so easy to slide into overweight and obesity.
Yeah.
And it's like watching a plant grow. Like you're not going to wake up tomorrow and be overweight, but this is why everybody past a certain age seems to have like this phenotype of like, it's the belly fat, it's the overweight, it's the fact, it's what explains that now, almost 1 in 2 adults is not just overweight, but obese.
Yeah. I mean, 3/4 of us, of adults, are overweight or obese. And you know what? It doesn't take a lot. 15 to 25 calories a day is generally what it takes for people to gain all that excess weight and become obese. So it's just, you're right. It's a little by little. And I think what is maybe a bit encouraging, a bit more optimistic in terms of how do you make this feasible? It can be overwhelming. But if you're going to start somewhere, of course, just cutting out, reducing, limiting the highly processed foods. You don't have to eliminate them, but just make them a smaller part of your diet. The refined flours, right? The refined grains, added sugars, sugar-sweetened beverages, I think just try to get out or reduce as much as possible. And once you learn what works for you, it's not like it's going to take all that effort all the time. I think that's the key, is that it's not going to be like you have to be looking up all of this science about what level of dark chocolate do I need and how am I going to make this be okay and what ingredients are in this. It doesn't have to be like that. I think you can get to a place where you find something that's sustainable. And I think we've talked about this a lot, is like the best diet is the one that you can stick to long term, because really people get into problems when you yo-yo diet or you can't adhere to something, right? It doesn't matter if a diet makes you lose a bunch of weight if you can't adhere to it, and you're going to change your diet and gain it all back.
Exactly. 100%. Amen. And I also think environment design is huge here. I think like putting the food in your house away, like keeping it out of sight. I think for me, I mean, personally, it's been such a game changer. And I can tell, like I bought recently this bag of Siete nacho chips. Like Siete is I have no affiliation with them, but they're like great, they've been in this sort of like better for you snack space for a really long time. They were recently bought by Pepsi, I believe. But they make really good, tasty products, pretty high quality ingredients, but they're still, snack foods. And I had like a bag out on my counter for the past couple days, and it's like every time I walk past my kitchen, I see the bag, and I'm reminded of how tasty those freaking chips are. And it's like it requires real mental effort for me to not want to go to the bag and just put a handful of those uber tasty chips into my face.
This is fascinating. I was talking with Mario Kratz, who's this great nutrition scientist, who was saying the actual just thinking of the food or looking at the food can actually change what's happening. Like your body can actually have even an insulin response to that. Like you start getting ready for it. Like there's that salivation that happens. I think you're completely right. And I think that's what you can control your home food environment, right? Like it doesn't change necessarily what's out there, but what you have in your home and how accessible it is. You've used the concept of friction. There's very little friction if it's just right on the counter, you grab it open. And then just like the constant reminders, there's just that craving. Like
cues, constant cues.
How do you resist that? I don't think that it's easy. You got to put it in a cupboard.
Yeah.
Right. Get it out of sight.
Literally out of sight, out of mind. That's there's a health like takeaway from that saying, and I think it's like incredibly valuable. Like just get it out, even if it's like a quote unquote health food, a food with a health halo, like get it out of sight. Crucially important stuff. I do want to ask you about artificial sweeteners, because you kind of mentioned them. As a nutrition scientist, what's your take on artificial sweeteners like aspartame, sucralose, etc.?
Well, a recent review by WHO, so the World Health Organization, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, they came out and it was this kind of big headline news that they actually recommended not consuming artificially sweetened beverages. And I think a lot of people were kind of surprised by that. They're low calorie, they're no calorie, right? It's like, how can that be a problem? And I think there's a lot of potential risk of these foods, but the evidence base is all mostly observational studies. So I don't think we can really know definitively what the health risk is. My general take is they're probably better for you than the sweetened beverages. Like if you personally cannot get yourself to stop drinking soda, drinking the diet soda with the artificial sweetener, I think is going to be healthier. I don't think there's a way to say that's going to not have some sort of benefit. And at the same time, it's not ideal or optimal because there are health risks. Part of it is from, the actual sweeteners themselves can potentially be linked to cancers. But there's also this aspect, I think, of the palate. Like it does not allow yourself to break free from the sweetness palate, the sort of the food environment, if you will. Like if you're used to doing that, it's like, well, what do you have with the soda? It's a burger and fries, or right? It's a Taco Bell or something. And so I think there's those types of drinks can fit into an unhealthy food environment, and it's not necessarily making you not crave those. You're still trying to crave those sorts of sweetness, right? It doesn't diminish your sweet taste preference.
The old fridge cigarette. But what about using them as a bridge? Like what about, if you are used to really hedonic food, like ultra processed foods, with very high food reward value, and you're trying to clean up your diet and retrain your palate. What about using non-caloric sweetened foods like diet sodas as a bridge to kind of supplement some of that lost dopamine as you adopt a lower calorie way of eating?
Yeah, I think that's a good use case for sure. I think they're better. Again, it can be a transition process, or even if you have to do it long term, I think it's going to be better than the sweetened beverages. It's just that the ideal goal is sort of to have water more as your primary liquid. I think that's
so boring.
Optimal. So boring.
Give me a more exciting answer than that.
But yeah, I think there are, if you're going to, and I think we were talking about this offline, but the sort of monk fruit extract, the sweetener, that I think is, it was not, from my understanding, included in those with the same health risks. And so if you're going to have that, there's this waffle mix. It's called Flourish. Has whole grain wheat. It has lots of fiber in it, lots of potassium. Like you can know that the whole food's there because there's a lot of potassium, not a lot of sodium, and it's sweetened with monk fruit. And so for my daughters, I'll make those waffles with the monk fruit in there, and I don't think that's a big risk. Like I'm totally fine with that.
Sounds great. Yeah, I've been a fan of allulose for some time, and I don't know if I haven't really tracked like the research on it, but I know that when I first dropped, there had already been like this body of literature pointing to some modest health benefit to consuming it. Who knows?
Yeah.
But yeah, stevia, monk fruit, those are pretty go-to. Those are pretty like regular go-tos for me. Well, Ty Beal, thanks for coming out. Thanks for sharing your research with us. This was super fun as always.
Good to be here.
Yeah, pumped for your paper, which just dropped. We can link it in the show notes, and also I'm pumped for my appearance on your super exciting podcast. I know we had a great chat about all things like brain health and nutrients for brain health, eating patterns for brain health. So definitely, guys, go and check that out. The Ty Beal Show. Just drop your handle so that people can follow you and send you any questions if they have them.
Will do. Thanks for having me, Max.
Yeah, of course. So it's Ty Beal on X, Insta.
Yeah. Ty Beal PhD is the handle across. So X, Instagram, socials, even the YouTube. You can get my new show there, the Ty Beal Show. Ty Beal PhD.
Love it. Thanks, guys, for listening. Share this episode with friends and loved ones, and I will catch you on the next episode. Peace. Hey, if you liked that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.